earlier, I'm Michael Fraser. I'm the postgraduate representative in the EHS committee, and I just want to really emphasise how fantastic a society it is for postgraduates to come and be a part of. For a small fee, you get involved in this network that helps you meet people, it gives you incredible opportunities to speak. And after you've spoken at either the summer or the winter conference, you then have the opportunity to put your paper forward as a publication. It's a really fantastic opportunity. It's a way many people have got their first publications, myself included. So would massively recommend. But that's enough about kind of plugging the society, and I'll move on to discussing our speaker. So everyone, today we're absolutely honoured to be joined by the Vice President of the Ecclesiastical History Society, Professor Miri Rubin. Now, I'm sure to many here in this virtual room, Miri will need no introduction. Simply put, she's one of the leading medieval historians of our age. Her prolific scholarship has contributed greatly to our understanding of medieval gender, urban life, bodies, identity, Jewish-Christian relations and religious cultures across 8 monographs and the editing of 5 collections. Her most recent book, Cities of Strangers, Making Lives in Medieval Europe, has joined her previous works, including Corpus Christi, the Eucharist in Late Medieval Culture, and the epic Mother of God, A History of the Virgin Mary, in receiving rave reviews and becoming required reading for students of the medieval period and religion across the world's universities. Likewise, her vast public engagement profile charts several hallmark in our time contributions and television interviews, as well as contributions on History Hit and YouTube. And we're thus truly honoured to have Professor Rubin as the incoming president of the EHS from summer 2026. Our presidential conference, the Church and Race, has already been plugged a little bit earlier, but just to drive that home, folks, it's promising to be a very important event in the 21st century study of the Church. Will take place in London from the 13th to 15th of July this year. You can find the details online. I warmly encourage all to attend. Now, today, Professor Rubin is here to speak to us on church history and the history of religious cultures, what and how. Professor Rubin, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And before we move on to mine, I just want to really plug that conference and to say that to work on race and racialization, I mean, I've already sent a direct message to David because I'm really hoping David's going to make a contribution this summer. I think it's not only about topics that are very obvious and very pressing, like slavery, transatlantic slavery, or like anti-Semitism and so on, that people, that have been dealt with a lot. It is up to us to define where these types of where race and racialization occurs within the church and within religious cultures. And I really encourage each of you. Actually, Michael, while you're there, would you be able to put in the chat just the sort of a link to our call for papers? And they're short papers, as you know, who then get the full, if they're chosen, the full editorial treatment of the excellent editorial team of our society. So, and I too had my first paper published in 1987 in the Ecclesiastical History Society, so Studies in Church History. So now you've actually situated yourself on my screen. So, Michael, my presentation has disappeared and it's necessary for what follows.
Oh, my apologies.
That's okay.
Sorry, just linking that in there.
I'll sort out the message.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry about that, folks.
Not to worry, not to worry at all. Why don't we move on to the next, please, Michael? Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure. We talked about this in the summer in Edinburgh, that it would be fun to have an event like this. That I was very keen to join in this event. So I'm just going to give you, we have this hour together and a little bit after for questions. And just to tell you what I'm going to try and do, I'm going to share with you my apprehension and my understanding that there has been a massive shift in the last few decades between an emphasis on the study of institutions when we study the church, when you study Christianity, the business of this society, from the study of institutions broadly cast to the study more of practices and the experiences of the people who make up the church in their whole diversity and over time and space. And once these desires are there to study them, as I shall explain, people look around for the appropriate sources, because the sources that support the study of the institutional church obviously cannot answer, and therefore over centuries have not answered the questions that we now want to ask. And these are, what's important is that they've become much more than texts. They're visual sources, material sources, architecture, the study of space and sound, and so on. We'll then move on to also look at some of the methods, and I was absolutely heartened to see that all the papers were really engaged with various forms of theory. And Aude just mentioned a minute ago that it tended to be French, but then that's the way it is, the division of intellectual labor, and to say how we go about it. And I thought the question from Alan Ford, although maybe a bit jocular, was actually a very well pointed one. How do PhD students in the 3 or 4 years that they have, how do they both do their research, write up their thesis, and also constantly equip themselves by reading in other disciplines and developing conceptual acuity? This is a very, very serious question. And as this shift has occurred from the emphasis on institutions to religious cultures, it is also notable that the project is carried by or delivered by different types of people. I mean, the most dramatic, need I say, is of course so many more women in leadership positions in this area, but there are other forms of diversity we'll touch upon. And also that when we look at this field as it has emerged, there is so much to be said about its global connections, already dealt with in the papers earlier, its diversity, its polemical edge, and there will be more to come also related to the technologies that now also inform our work. So let's move on to the next slide and start with myself, because it just seems obvious that, given that I've sort of lived across the decades that I'm describing, it is not unreasonable to use my own experience as a sounding board in order to talk about broader trends. And one could have chosen other people, but myself is a good example, and it's easily available to me. And just a list of the books where you see even where everyone was talking in the 1980s about communities, and then in the 1990s about bodies, and then emotions became a thing. The polemical edge, as I published a text, which is the first ever known text, which accuses Jews of child murder, Cities of Strangers with its diversity, and I hope the book that I'm close to completing, and which is informed also my choice of the topic for the summer conference, about the operations of race and the meanings of Blackness in the biblical tradition, or enabled by the biblical tradition. So that's just me, and I thought it also an occasion to, in a way, introduce myself to those who aren't medievalists amongst the community that is gathered here. So let's move to the next, please. So the shift I'm talking about is one that seeks to respond to what are later 20th century social trends arising from, of course, the struggles around the inclusion of women, the ecumenical aspirations of churches, the greater diversity among scholars and students alike, of course, as education has, on the whole, higher education become much more, it casts its net much more socially widely than it would have been in the 20s or in the 19th century, and so on. There's also something about the churches that probably people in this room know more than I do, which is about, whereas in the past it was seen very much as the part of the career structure and aspirations of clergy, men of the cloth in all the traditions, to have some sort of aspect dedicated, and very formally in some parts of it, in some orders, in some institutions, sort of part of the life was a life of scholarship. I think with a lot of ministry understood as expressing itself in different ways, in social action, in involvement in communities, and so on. We have fewer clergy scholars, I actually think. And whereas I remember going to the first conferences of the Ecclesiastical History Society, there was a very large number of people there were working clergy, people who had a bit of time for the scholarship and were also, had communities. And I mean, we still have such members, but it's much less of a sort of notable and deeply involved group, I think, than it was. And of course, some people amazingly combine the two. But I think there is a shift in terms of how people who are embedded in the institutions of the church understand their own priorities and the place of scholarship amongst them. And then there is the change in intellectual styles, the interdisciplinarity, the turn to the social sciences, which we already saw in the presentations today. So all of those, I think, very much of the present developments, social, institutional, and intellectual, have affected the way the study of the church and the study of religion is being conceptualized and delivered. Next, please. Thank you. And it so happened that in 2007, we had a colloquium at the Institute of Historical Research that I co-organized. And there, the very great medievalist, Professor Giles Constable, who has died since, gave, and he had a very, very long and venerable career that saw him from Harvard to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He wrote an enormous amount about monasticism, about the Crusades, about the Cistercians in particular. A really extraordinary learned individual. And he was already in retirement when he came to speak to us. He described very movingly his own life as a life that saw this movement from church history to religious cultures, the study of medieval life and spirituality, and in a way tried to analyze, and that was published in this here volume that's on the left. So his lifetime coincided sort of mostly from sort of mid-20th century and until well into the 21st, coincided with these moves, and he himself saw himself responding, and it was an interesting event to have someone literally telling us the story through his own life. Next, please. So the emergent themes and emphases are not so much, and I really mean this, not so much replacement of the old, that we do not need to know how a diocese is run, or we do not need to know theology, theological debates minutely and carefully and responsibly studied, not at all. But it is rather new questions to put to materials old, when resulting in new types of syntheses. I'm thinking just of these two exemplary books, exemplary in their ambition, but also their influence has been quite extraordinary. And I'll return to one of them, to the one on the left, in a few minutes. So these are two studies. I think probably people know them very well, that exemplify in their own practice a command of all aspects of ecclesiastical history as traditionally conceived, but also were interested in to emphasize communities and individuals, from being a study of men to being a study of men and women and more, from the disembodied person to caring for the embodied nature of religious experience, and of course the emotional nature of that experience too. There's a notable move, particularly in Eamon Duffy's book, looking not just at Latin, but at vernacular practices, and vernacular practices in writing, in drama, in self-expression, from the norms, what a Christian should be, to how Christians live their lives, in fact, mindful of those norms and yet coping with a whole lot of other expectations from them. And of course, all that produces really from uniformity to diversity. Now, of course, nobody ever believed that everyone was the same, but it's a question, or experience in the same way. It's a question of the emphasis, how much intellectual labor, how much labor tout court you invest in order to explore the diversity. and going into the parishes, as Eamon Duffy did, found all sorts of wonderful things in them. Of course, he also had a very strong overarching argument about the nature of the Reformation. But while he did his work, he just revealed the whole regional diversity and the daily lives of people through their parish attachments. It's a really good example, I think, of that, what I might call from institutions to religious cultures. Moving on. And the shifts, again, just to remind you that it coincided with changes that were happening not just in the field of the history of religion and religious institutions, but again, it's the effect of the history of women and the history of gender. Just a really good example of Diane Elliott's book about the treatment of women religious enthusiasts and how the church sort of responds to them and what it does with them. And so that's one thing, is including women and the whole variety of their aspirations and experiences. And the other is moving from elites, well-documented elites, to ways of finding about the ordinary laity, let's call them, be they rural or urban, which is what John Arnold attempts to do in the book that came out last year, this here book about lay religion in Languedoc. And he does it through every possible approach, textual, he visits parish churches, he looked at inquisitorial trials, and so on. So again, the move is the inclusion of women, half of the population, right, at any time, more or less, sometimes more, and on the other hand, moving from elites to non-elites, okay? Moving on. So just to return for a moment to Caroline Bynum's super influential book, I'm always finding it cited in unexpected places of different periods and different parts of the world. So she, Holy Feast and Holy Fast, fantastic title. The Eucharist is that holy feast. And she looks at it by studying concertedly a few hundreds of vitae, a genre we already studied today, hagiographical writings about women, mostly by men, of course, and how they describe particularly, and she found that there was a particular way of describing women's attachment to the Eucharist. Now, women could not consecrate the Eucharist. They could receive it, of course, and if they're in a religious institution, more frequently than a lay person, but there was more. They were imagining particular associations with the Eucharist. They were imagining a certain type of very deep union in their bodies with Christ through the Corpus Christi. And those female theologians, I think it's fair to call someone like Hildegard of Bingen a theologian, and mystics, the centrality of the Eucharist, as opposed to, for example, the crucifixion itself as an image that organized their thought and their devotional practices. And she really put to the fore the fact that their bodies seemed to respond through hunger, through yearning, through bleeding, through all sorts of ways of engaging with the Eucharist. That she was able to discern, and to discern patterns that were gendered. So this is an example of how this worked how this worked out. So Caroline Bynum, to the Alan Ford question, she had all the traditional skills of going about her research, but she was interested in feminist theory. She was reading some of the French theory very, very, very gently. And in a way, she created historically embedded theory by her own practice. Moving on. Another person I like to point out, and moving to a little bit later period, is someone who, so that's Caroline Bynum on the issue of gender, and R.W. Scribner, a wonderful example about, okay, you want to talk about lay people, but how do you do it? So in his case, in terms of the Reformation in Germany, he was interested, I mean, of course, there are all the theological debates happening amongst, elite theologians who are going to change the world of Christianity. But how do people find out about it? How do they get informed about their debates? And he went for cheap print. just cheap print like broadsheets and various just single-page images or pamphlets or whatnot. And he looked at the imagery. How is the old Catholic Church, as it were, presented, and how is the polemic with it? How is the polemic with the Catholic Church represented powerfully to engage people, to develop in them disgust towards the old church and passion for the new church and so on. He simply looked at cheap print. So again, this is not something that had been done before, and this is part of a very big project, which goes back to the question, of course, that Laura raised of he wasn't judging, but he did show that there were ways of expressing religion and talking about religion that historians had never noticed before when they were looking only at certain type of canonical theological texts. So this was inherently polemical stuff, so albeit it was extremely nasty about the Catholic Church and the Pope, as you see over there, perhaps, but that was the language of the sources that he was that he was that he was exploring, and indeed for the first time. He died sadly at the age of 57, and we would have liked to have heard far more from him. So you have to make the sources match really the um, the uh, the task, and you have to find them. And it was quite common to say when people were skeptical at the beginning of this movement, or indeed the beginning of the movement of the history of women, to say, "Oh, it's all very well, but there aren't the sources because they never simple people or women didn't leave them behind." And when you're committed, you somehow find the sources, is my view. And I'll show you how. So, for example, in the desire to understand popular belief and this whole phenomenon of, in a way, dissenting religion, I won't use the word heresy for reasons I'm sure you can all divine, or rather, I won't use it a lot. But there are sources that engage with large bodies of ordinary people, be they serfs in manorial court rolls, or be they people in villages suspected of dissenting and acting heretically. And then the interviews with them, interviews, very nasty interviews, interrogations, often under the threat or indeed under torture, that are then recorded minutely. And we have these records. And here in 1977 already, an amazing study of an early 14th century, very concerted set of inquisitorial trials in the Languedoc, right in southern France, southwestern France, revealing networks of unorthodox beliefs and a variety of social practices to go with them. That is to say, people believe because they've met someone, they've had a meal with them, they learned from them this alternative Christianity, then they passed it on themselves. It really is about networks. And here, really, network analysis, I'll return to this. It's very, very useful to understand why. But in 77, this became such an extraordinary bestseller. It was literally selling in sort of like airports and railway stations because it was written up by someone who is just a fantastic writer and one of these French great, what they call vulgarizers. But in France, it doesn't mean a bad thing. It means a good thing, getting it there out to people, what we now call public engagement. And that showed us, that showed those historians who wanted to talk about the experience of the many, not the few, that these sources which were there to chastise, to discipline, to correct, sometimes to ultimately destroy and annihilate and burn these people, nonetheless were really interested in them. They were very, very interested in their ideas because they felt, this was a threat to the wholesomeness of the church and other believers. So they've left us the most extraordinary sources, which we have to use very carefully. We have to be sure what level of mediation there is in terms of translation and transcription and whatnot. And there have been lots of debates about this, but there always are about important and rich sources. And this was the first example of how what a window can be opened upon a whole array of beliefs. But what was also very clear is that the religious beliefs were utterly intertwined with routines of household and of neighborhood and social practices of, literally sociability. Moving on to another example of using inquisitorial trials. Michael? Thank you. Carlo Ginzburg, a few years later, he studied the 16th century. Again, a set of trials, because this guy was tried 3 times. Menocchio, we're moving to northern Italy here. The cheese and the worms, famously, another set of inquisitorial trials. And lo and behold, what do we find is that a 16th century miller, that is a fairly modest, a man of modest means and of no sort of, vast social authority, but somebody who sits around and talks to a lot of people, talks to merchants, talks to substantial peasants, and so on, and particularly people passing through and bringing a grain and other wares from other parts of the region. That's always also an exchange in ideas that's happening there, and even sometimes the exchange of books. So we have a very, very well-read Miller who develops cosmologies of his own. Again, it's not somebody we would have known about had we gone to a learned library and looked for printed books, because he never would have produced them. But on the other hand, he consumed them. And for the views that he therefore developed, in consequence, he was tried repeatedly. And that the brilliance of Carlo Ginzburg brings to the fore in a very, very interesting way. Next, please. So one of the ways is to look at serial sources, rich sources that, yes, are meant to be punitive and meant to be corrective and are disapproving in their very essence, but their job is to record, so they get something, they leave something for us historians to carefully dissect and study and analyze, and thus to understand the sort of variety of unexpected beliefs that ordinary people held. And another thing that ordinary people, or not just ordinary people, that people had were, of course, objects. So it's not just text. So far, I've talked about texts and images, and we move into objects. And objects are another way, another type of resource that we study to great benefit, and it's sort of in the last few decades. Now, this is not to say, and often when we're working on material objects, we go back to various catalogs from museums, from collections. It's not like people in the past did not know that chalices and patens were super interesting and beautiful things. Of course they did. But the question is, do you actually turn this into the matter that you are studying systematically and combining with other sources, devotional texts, and so on? So, for example, here, the book on the left is a book that came out of a big project funded, I think, by the HRC that was run by Mary Lavin in Cambridge. And it's about the objects in the home, the devotional objects that people had at home, both stuff that has survived, but even more so from inventories, from descriptions in ego documents, and so on about stuff that people used. The book on the right is a very nice book by the great art historian at Harvard, Jeffrey Hamburger, which is about the art made by nuns, Dominican German nuns in the 15th century. This particular cache that's very effective. And so he very effectively combines the art of their own hands. And here you see a very, very, very complex image about the nun dwelling in Christ's heart as he hangs from the cross. For meditative purposes. So you see that, but you can read it alongside devotional texts that they had. You know where their house was. It still exists. You have texts about them. And so taking seriously, in this case, not just objects, but objects that they actually made. So I don't know what to call them, not ego documents, but ego objects or something of the kind, which is extremely, extremely effective. Moving on. And this attention to the object also means that we can reread our text. In this case, I'm just showing you a number of texts associated with the Mass, the Te Igit, or the canon of the Mass, and often illuminated with images that pertain to that very moment at the altar. So you see there, we can look at these images and we can see the altar and the many objects on it, which you can immediately identify here. That's the moment of the elevation on the right and in the middle, and everything that's happening around, the lights, the curtains, the people on their knees, the vestments, the laity in the middle image, And just to appreciate the vast amount, not obviously little has survived, but the vast amount of, I always think of it like housekeeping. There's just so much going on at an altar during the Mass, and everything is symbolically charged. Above all, that moment, next, please, Michael. The moment of the elevation captured here in a 13th century English manuscript, where we literally have every one of the senses stimulated, from the bell being rung on the left, people on their knees, clasping their hands together in prayer. We'll return to the laity at the moment of the elevation in a minute. Lights. So basically, every one of the senses is present there. So for me, when I did my book Corpus Christi in the 80s and I studied this, I studied it more or less in order to say what was supposed to be there and who was supposed to be there. By a decade later, I was thinking of it much more in terms of the senses. The combination of the senses that actually they're telling me the story right there. Okay, next, please. And of course, we moved on to even better understanding through lots of wonderful studies that there's an element of gesture here. There's the objects, there are the words, there are the colors, there are the visions that some people attached. Often visionaries have visions during the Mass or during a liturgical event, and the sounds. And we try where we can to be able to document for a particular event or for a particular institution all those things coming together. And of course, perforce, it also means having the skills to look at all the different types of sources, or at least doing it collaboratively with colleagues who can help. Next. And as I said, I'll return to the moment of the elevation or of communion. You see here, I love this picture because it shows you that in some places, what's called in English, a housling cloth, a cloth under people's chins as they take communion, lest any like crumbs of the host, which is of course the Corpus Christi, might break off or fall or anything of the kind. So it's all collected into this liturgical object, which is the housling, the cloth, and will be dealt with appropriately later on. But you see the laity here on their knees. So this is in this case, because it's so beautiful, I brought it. It's the actual reception. But to go back to the moment of the elevation, we just saw in the previous images a wonderful book by Pam King from about 20 years ago. Pamela King showed just the array of vernacular salutations to the Eucharist at the moment of the elevation were available in liturgical books and in other types of texts, so that the laity are participating in their own language. And they may say a few words in the Latin, but they understand what's going on, because there's these long-held ideas about, oh, the liturgy was all in Latin, nobody understood anything. It's totally debunked by actually looking at documents of practice and finding that that when the laity participated, they actually knew what they were doing and they had a role to play. Next, please. And about the finding of more and more evidence of vernacular liturgical participation, I should say that the leader on this has been Helen Gitos of Oxford, a wonderful study of liturgy, who just found in so many medieval liturgical books a whole lot of English. So what is this doing there, she asked, and pursued this. But this particular finding is by Penny Granger in a book from about 15 years ago about religious drama. You don't have to remember that, but the important thing here, this is a 15th century text of a play, the play about the Magnificat, the visit to Elizabeth. And I mean, I'm not expecting you to actually be able to read it, but maybe you can. You'll see in the middle of the page, Magnificat anima mea, right? And that's in Latin, but that it's immediately in English. And Penny Granger, suggests that maybe what we had here in this play situation, that the actor said it in the Latin, and in some sense, the audience may have responded in the English. But whatever it is, there's a ready-to-hand version of both the Latin and the English of this all important, I think we can call it a canticle. So the English is not far from the liturgical act, and that means that so many more people can be understood by us of taking part knowingly, perhaps even participating, be called to participate in these actions. Again, stuff that we would have never thought of in the past, and we would never, and people didn't look for either, because it was expected that, the laity are not part of that section of institutional Christianity. They are recipients. Moving on. So, and again, looking even at, highly regulated events like the foundation of a new liturgical feast, Corpus Christi here, once we are interested in it, what we find is that women play very, very important roles. So in the case of Corpus Christi, it's a fantastic story where from the 1240s, this one beguine from the Low Countries, Juliana of Mount Cognon, was lobbying. She said that, what the calendar really needs is a new Eucharistic. It needs a Eucharistic feast. The Eucharist, yes, there's Maundy Thursday, and there's all sorts of occasions, but an actual day just to celebrate the extraordinary privilege and wonder that is the Eucharist. That's what is needed. And it was related very much. She was very much one of the Bynum women whose spirituality was much, much informed by sensitivity to the Eucharist and reflecting on it. So she managed to, so this is what she's going on about. And some people find her tedious, but one did not, and that's her local bishop, the Bishop of Liège. So he founds it for his own diocese, which he sort of can do with his own authority. But then when a local man who was part of that circle becomes actually Pope several years later in 1264, and he's reminded of this we have the correspondence with the Low Countries, he makes it a universal feast, Corpus Christi, and the rest is history, as we may say. And the reception of the feast, therefore, is wide-ranging, and it's everywhere, and particularly in urban communities, in very elaborate processions. But for us, what's important here is being able to trace these circulation of ideas from unexpected places to creating normative facts within the institution. So it's just a wonderful example of how, yes, of course you have to understand the institutional church and how and of course from the moment that the feast is founded, there are liturgies that get circulated, there are rules about it in canon law, etc., etc. But the moment came from a place that is not usually part of the official story, from the imagination of a religiously enthusiastic woman. Moving on. So we have new questions, and we have identified sources to match our desires to ask these new questions, many of them around women and inclusion, others about engaging with ordinary people, as it were. And we also find that, or people have found, or scholars have found, indeed each one of those I've mentioned, that new methodologies, often from other disciplines, have been really, really useful in their endeavors. Okay, so let's move on and see what these may be. Some of them you'll know for sure, and indeed we already had some of them mentioned in the course of, and it's very much back to the Alan Ford question about how you do it. That's maybe in the questions about how literally to structure a program of self-education, because as somebody said in the box in the chat that he goes to Cambridge but nobody ever teaches him these things, and I think on the whole that's very true. So I think anthropology has been found to be really, really, really useful, and I think it goes back to the Laura Brown question about anthropology tries to observe, tries to map, tries to make connections rather than judging. The only thing one might say that anthropology has a very strong embeddedness within colonial systems in terms of where people were able to go, how their research was enabled, and their very system of understanding, as it were, what used to be called primitive societies. Lots of books with primitive societies in them. There's sociology talking about institutions, but talking in different types of ways. There's literary theory that's like really, really important. And we're going back here also to De Certeau. That is, we are dealing with texts all the time. How do we read them against the grain? How do we understand their, how do we learn to read with complexity, to notice what we need to notice, right? And of course, training ourselves in understanding the art and visual media, understanding the connection between the intent and the effect, the tension between what is for private and what's for public use, the whole question of patronage of religious art, and of course, just getting to know the prevailing iconography and not to err and not to make silly mistakes, all of that. But these are all directions that have been very, very important for and of course we had Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari mentioned. I'm not sure where we would put them. In some ways they're sociologists, in some ways they're I suppose nowadays we call them social theorists, but I mean they fit into this sort of thing. The fact that we're sitting here in 2026 and I was that music to my ears that people are actually looking and reading and thinking and in this particular way, each one of the papers. That was really, really great. So you exemplify the state we're in. Moving on, I'll give a few examples from anthropology. I know this is very, very old. This is from the 60s, but Clifford Geertz is still the most cited anthropologist for historians. What was very attractive about him is looking at religion as a cultural system. This famous article in this here collection of essays of his, it had a vast, vast influence. Equally influential was just his method of thick description, which is like looking at an event, looking at a ritual, looking at a time-bound event, and trying to appreciate all the affordances that rise from him, but also looking at the ritual as a perspective that allows you to discern social relations, political systems, and all those dynamics. And it's very much the ritual event as not exactly a battleground, but a place of encounter of all these influences, something that is never quite fixed. It's quite, in our language, people say, oh, it's just ritual as something like fossilized or something without, sort of authenticity. In fact, ritual is full of possibility. You never know what's going to happen. Everything and anything can go wrong. I mean, we all know that just looking at, I don't know, recently, what did we all watch together? Probably the coronation not long ago, etc. I mean, so his picture is a very dynamic one, and a lot of historians have found it really, really useful. It's still an essay that's worth knowing about, not least because of its vast influence. But moving on. So then there's Mary Douglas, who's also very useful because of her, it's very much a structuralist anthropologist that expects in all places and all times certain structures to prevail around the operations of the sacred and the non. The sacred always is defined by what is non-sacred, the purity by that which endangers it, and on the boundary between them, there are feelings like disgust, there are feelings like fear, between the pure and the impure, often aligned with men and women or with Christians and non-Christians. So, and she is a very good example of this prevailing intellectual style of the later 20th century, which was structuralism, then produced sort of post-structuralism that animated the humanities and social sciences. It's still, I think, very, very useful in the analysis of rituals, but of course, it doesn't stand on its own as a disembodied theory. It has to be related to the sources that we read. So we read, I don't know, liturgical guides or handbooks of liturgy or theological reflections, and we can just sort of notice things because we have read Mary Douglas and because we understand these operations of the pure and the impure in so many realms of social and cultural interaction. Moving on. Um, so just a little aside, just to say, both of them really, really helped me when I was looking at the Corpus Christi processions then, and because that's the one on the top is the closest I could get to a photo from the 15th century. It's basically from a 15th century lectionary, but all the different bits are in place. Something more recent you see there at the bottom. So what do we want to bear in mind? We look at the social order on display in a procession. We look at the hierarchy that's displayed. We look at the holy out of doors. How do you protect the pure, as it were, from the impure, be it from rain or hail or people just, knocking into it and knocking it off its perch or whatever. And of course, a lot of other economic elements like the expense, who bears it, who gets to display themselves and their corporations in it. So all of this analysis of the processions, it really, really helped me to have a sort of anthropological, insight in my mind. Moving on. Another anthropologist, super, super interesting. So Tanya Luhrmann, she's more, obviously, she's younger than the others I just mentioned, and she was actually exactly my generation in Cambridge. She brought very much the self and the body into the study of religion. She sees the religious experience as a deeply emotional one, deeply subjective, though within the structures, obviously, of the system. She started, this was in Cambridge, she actually joined some covens in Tooting Bec, and she went underground and she went to some covens where they knew she was an anthropologist, and one of them she went not. Very interesting use of anthropology in the study of contemporary witchcraft. She wrote this wonderful book, The Persuasions of the Witch's Craft. She then went to America and, well, she studied what was around there, which bringing all this anthropological insight, but very, very much with a sort of feminist awareness, with interest in emotions and the body in her study, for example, of evangelical charismatic religion. And now she's writing about prayer. Moving on. And anthropologists themselves have changed, of course, in the sort of post-colonial world. They don't go out, as it were, to places. They go to Tooting Bec, or as she did, sort of, Southern California, and they're not welcome in place. I mean, on the whole, the anthropological establishment in a whole lot of countries, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, are peopled by local people, local scholars, not like it used to be. So anthropologists have very much turned, as one article puts it, the anthropologist at home, as it were. So she's at home in California doing that work. David Graeber, similarly, I just noticed recently a number of cases of medievalists working with using his work. Indeed, I examined a PhD recently of Edmund van der Molen from Nottingham, a wonderful PhD on the canonization of a 15th century female mystic. But what's important for us here is David Graeber very much uses terms that are normally associated with economic activity, production, and value. And he develops a theory of social relations and culture that is about what people do in their communities is always in the attempt to generate value, but value not in terms of money, but value in terms of a sort of a cultural resonance, something that's meaningful. So in his case of Edmund, he demonstrated the types of participations, the words people use when they give evidence in a canonization process. Why go to the trouble, to the town where the canonization is being, where the inquisitors are there and asking questions, etc. Why go to the trouble? Why craft your testimony? So you don't get paid for it. No, but what you get paid for it, what results is a certain type of generation of value in terms of having been one who has participated in this all important. And again, we see here the canonization is super institutional and from above, and yet people use those institutional moments in order to generate value, something that matters in their own lives, according to David Graeber. Moving on. And there's one anthropologist that I think many of you will know, and he works on contemporary America. Very, very interesting, Robert Orsi. Very familiar to anyone who does pre-modern religion, except that he does it sort of in, I don't know, in New York, basically, and more recently he looked at Texas as well. But he looks at Catholic life, which is often also associated with a certain ethnic identity in the United States, and analyzes what he's coined the term lived religion. So it's usually about ordinary people in modest neighborhoods. People are working hard, who don't have a lot of time on their hands, who aren't super educated, but their religion is fervent with all sorts of forms of creativity. So that's Robert Orsi. So he's supposed, he's in the line of the anthropologists, I suppose, but he comes from a very different direction. He's not super theoretical. He's more ethnographic than although he has actually his more recent work, he's written some theoretical essays. But what was really striking is about, just sitting there and watching people, basically, which what we can't do historians on the whole, but he can do, and that helps us historians too, I think. Moving on. So I talked a lot about anthropology, just to talk about a number of attempts to use sociology in the service of understanding the church better. And to just one very, very famous example is R.I. Moore. Many of you may know his book, The Formation of a Persecuting Society. So this maybe didn't totally work. I mean, it worked fantastically because it's gone to lots of editions and it's debated and it's used in all sorts of periods and places. It's all about how the church in the 12th century became a thing, sort of bureaucratized in a very formal way through canon law, developed its sacramental provisions, created the parish system, which really didn't exist fully before, and that while it builds its capacities, it also necessarily has to be much more definite about what lies beyond, that is, what is not acceptable. Definitions about heresy, that's the word, definitions about the difference that are Jews, definitions about sexual comportment and so on. It's all very, very, very neat. He's very much informed by Max Weber's ideas about bureaucracies, and the bureaucracy has its own language. It's like the Latin of the clergy, etc. It's been really fruitful just because it just sparked so much conversation. And, it came out in 87 when nobody was talking about these types of excluded groups, as it were, as one, comparing between them. So it's really, really interesting. But he was very early in bringing this type of sociological insight into our conversations. And then I'm going to move into another book that has already been mentioned here, and I'm thrilled that it was, and that was by Shun Ran. As you see, actually, Ian Forrest is one of my PhD students, I'm proud to say. And Trustworthy Men is this book that, yes, it looks at bishops, what could be more institutional, but it says, how do bishops actually manage all their business? In fact, both business in land and wealth, and business in terms of reporting about parishes and about parish priests and so on, do so by identifying trustworthy men, which of course intersects with John Ran's paper, and it's a very smart book. It's informed by sociological theory. Also, he's recently written a book about gender and authority in the church, which he proudly holds there. So there are also sort of some sociological moments that have been very useful, like the ones that I've just shown. Moving on. So the last bit of the paper is to just point out to you something that I hinted at earlier, which is, of course, that in the course of all this change, the scholars themselves have changed. That is, who we are. And just looking at our room, even I don't know many of you, but from names, from looking at you, from hearing you, learning a little bit about you, this is an extremely diverse group of people. But again, like always in history, there is structure to what has happened. So let's move on and say, so as I intimated earlier, Michael, everywhere the move towards the participation of women, the interest in women's scholarship was definitely led by female scholars in every way. Now it's so mainstream that men, women, young, old, are all dealing with it. But that was an important change. That was a really, really important change over the period that I've been surveying to see the contribution, the leadership of women as we saw the emphasis moving from clergy and Latin theology to vernacular theology, because most of the women, the mystics, etc., who have written in their vernacular. So what I'm saying is that the move towards vernacular theology, that's a term that's been coined, and to mysticism and mystics, which of course we mentioned in Laura's paper with the affinity towards spiritualism. All that has come from that move, the sort of the women setting agendas, choosing to do research on particular issues, and therefore changing our idea of what theology is. Nobody talked about vernacular theology before this move. So that's been a massive, massive contribution. Doesn't mean we don't study Latin theology anymore. Of course we do, and Hildegard wrote in Latin, but most women wrote in the vernacular, and that's very significant. Moving on. So again, we touched on this in our Brad Gregory moment. From confessionally related scholarship to a diversity of approaches. What I mean, it doesn't, not to say that there aren't people who come maybe from a Catholic background who study Catholics, of course, and that's absolutely fine, and that is the case still very much. But there are lots of people who are approaching without that sort of background at all, and therefore perhaps without also the traditional type of polemical sort of instincts or reflexes, should I say. So let's move on. Although I find the concept of methodological neutrality to be difficult. I would say, I mean, difficult to deliver. I think that maybe something, as Laura was talking, I was thinking maybe something like methodological totality, that is telling more of the story and sharing more of the story, more parts of the story, which is what I've been trying to suggest right now, rather than aspiring to a neutrality, which could be quite, I don't know, maybe detracting from a certain intellectual engagement, but I'm not sure about that. But like, for example, if we look at the area of liturgy, the study of medieval or any liturgy, the great people of even when I was a student, they were all men in orders, all. Père Gilles, Gregory Dix, Marc Dekmans, Père Martimor. They were often French, Belgian, I mean, absolutely fantastic experts, some great, great centers like Solesmes, where they were also experts in the music of the liturgy. They actually had amazing choirs. They recorded it. They were absolute centers of excellence. Now, Solesmes happily still exists, but moving on. In 2010, some of my PhD students got together, and they were terribly interested in liturgy, and they were neither priests nor monks, and they were grappling for the tools, grappling for the authority, grappling for the models of how to do it if they wanted to. And they put out, okay, they got some £2,000 from the HRC, which was something PhDs could get at the time. And they, with that money, they put out a call for papers and basically provided sandwiches and coffee, not much more, for anybody who would come to Queen Mary on those days. And they invited one keynote speaker. They had people brought themselves on their own, at their own expense, PhD students, postdocs, really excited about a new type of history of liturgy, allowing themselves into the club, right? They came from literature, from drama, from folklore. I just sat there to watch because I was so proud of them. Moving on. They, since have all the organizers become fantastic historians with wonderful books. And you see they about time, about Mary, about the Bible, all sorts of liturgy related subjects, and I'm very proud of them. But the main thing was they were none of them coming with that institutional authority of a religious institution. And I'm almost done. Moving next to the next one. Yes, just other. This was the keynote. It was the great Susan Boynton from Columbia with her two books there. So, and new ways of doing it, obviously acquiring it. Can you ever get on top of the liturgy, if you haven't celebrated every day of your adult life, these are the questions. Who's allowed to do what? Who can even do it well? Moving on, we're almost done. And of course, we are so interested now in liturgy, but we do it in some different ways. We connected it with studies of space, of access of the laity, even of animals into religious spaces. I've seen that done. We look at objects as well. The liturgy has become a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk in a way that it wasn't when it was studied very much from the traditions of establishing very authoritative texts. Next. Next again. Oh, just to say, another good example when the field diversifies, who's doing the history, as I said earlier. So Peter Burke always used to like to call me, the Jewish anthropologist of the Eucharist sort of thing. I've never myself partaken, I've observed, I've seen, I've used all the tools to understand it. It's not saying that there aren't other ways of doing, but it's also a way. Somebody like Sarah Lipton was a brilliant art historian, again, looking at anti-Jewish sentiment in what are some of the finest artworks of medieval Christianity. Again, bringing a sensibility that's something that she cares about that has not been done before. So where we come from and what we bring obviously contributes to the totality. I won't say that Sarah Lipton is methodologically neutral when she looks at Christian imagery that's anti-Jewish, but she's telling some part of the story that has not been told before. Moving on, I think here I'm finishing. I'll just move on from that because that's something else that she did, but we can skip. And in the area of music, also just to say, the attempt to bring things together, the art, the music, the liturgy, the people, to try and create, and sometimes recreating, also related to recording in the right sort of spaces and attending the acoustics as well. And thus we get to know more about how people experience their religion. So let's move on to the last, I think it's the last slide, very quickly, just to say, because somebody asked, what is DH? So just to say, move on to the next slide, please. Just to say that there are amazing, we're going to keep amazing opportunities out there. And as we develop new skills and digital tools, we absolutely must continue to train in the languages, in the codicology, the paleography, awareness of genre and literary conventions, and so on. But digital tools are used now, to study large bodies of materials, to read hundreds of lives of saints. It would have been so much quicker for, Caroline Bynum than if she had that to study large bodies of scanned indulgences, sermons, to do the most extraordinary searches. And just because we talked about rhizomes, just also point out that digital network analyses of various types and mapping projects are extremely exciting, and they reveal things that we could not see with just our naked, well-meaning eye. And scientific methods are also being used in order to look at erasure, at the movement of books across confessional boundaries. And I'll just leave you with the last slide, which is a picture about these two projects. One of them, the one on the left, is about mapping, using digital manipulation to map the movement of women deemed heretical in Languedoc by my colleague at Queen Mary Delphi Nieto Isabel. And on the right, a big HRC project about literally books moving across confessions or religions with non-invasive technologies that allow to look behind erasures and to try and divine this very odd behavior. So I hope that you have a sense that this is a wonderful field to be operating in. It's not easy. There's a lot of work to be done, but places, well, your supervisors, but also if you're a PGR, Ecclesiastical History Society is a sort of place where you can find a lot of friends who can help and support. No question is too small, and you can always start with me. So there we are.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic paper. Really eye-opening, really inspirational, thinking about how to take some of those methodologies